BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to this weekend episode of Black Box Online Radio. On the weekends, I've been doing a regular segment about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey from 1996. Also on this channel, I've started releasing several short episodes in the YouTube Shorts section, and they are 1-minute true crime book reviews. Today I will be discussing some information from the book The Other Side of Suffering by John Ramsey, and I was going to wait until I had finished the book to do a 1-minute review on this one. However, I found some rather startling information in the book. One more time, The Other Side of Suffering by John Ramsey. It is the second book that John Ramsey authored that was a response to the events after his daughter's death. The first one was called The Death of Innocence, which I have included not only in that series, but I've used that as the source material for several other episodes here on Black Box Online Radio. And in some recent episodes, I had talked about the ransom note that was left behind. There was a 2.5-page ransom note that was left in the Ramsey household after JonBenet had been abducted. And I also did one on the psychological profile of the killer, and I thought that this was a good continuation of the series by talking about the DNA evidence. I'm going to read 2 pages from the book The Other Side of Suffering, and this is from the chapter Life in Chaos. It's the 4th chapter in the book. Now it's going to start with some additional information, then it will get to the parts about the DNA. Between January and April of 1997, Patsy gave 5 extensive handwriting samples. She was exhausted and we were beginning to get the picture. The police were trying to prove that Patsy had written the 3-page ransom note. We couldn't comprehend such an idea. Patsy agonized over and over again. "Oh, John, what have I ever done to give anyone the idea that I could kill my baby?" Some seasoned investigators outside of the Boulder Police Department believed that JonBenet's murder was a kidnapping gone wrong. Others believed that the killer was a demented pedophile. In searching for information, I learned that pedophiles typically take a child, molest them, and then let them go. To me, the ransom note read like the ramblings of a very young, unstable person with a disgusting, sick mind and imagination influenced by crime movies. Still, the police were focusing all their suspicion on Patsy and me. From the beginning, police psychologists advised the detectives that the ransom note was not the kind of note a parent would write. All the credible experts assessed the likelihood of us being the author of the note and determined that to be nil. The Secret Service handwriting experts concluded that neither Patsy nor I had written the note. That didn't seem to deter the police away from their quick conclusion that we were guilty. A veteran district attorney told me, "There is nothing more dangerous in this country than a police department that has made up its mind." The police department had made up its mind on day one and were not about to be swayed by facts or evidence. Police are supposed to investigate a crime and turn the results of the investigation over to the prosecuting attorney. They are not empowered to determine guilt or innocence. Now, here's the part about the DNA. Because a pubic hair was found on the blanket covering JonBenet's body, police subjected us to the most humiliating and embarrassing of procedures. On an icy February morning, a friend drove us to the Boulder Community Hospital to have pubic hair taken for comparison and testing. We were mortified. We were taken to separate examination rooms and told to disrobe and lie down on the table for examination. 2 detectives stood alongside, watching as the nurse combed the pubic hair, transferring a sample to an envelope. Snipping away, she gave the envelope to the officers. I bit my lip, went through it, but it made me angry to think that Patsy was forced to endure the same humiliating process in another room. This was the beginning of a total assault on our privacy and personal lives. Patsy told me later that she had burst into sobs because the nurse had been wearing a pink sweatshirt with red hearts like the ones she and JonBenet had used to make with puffy pens for Valentine's Day. "Can we please get out of here now?" she asked. "Yes, we're finished," I said. There was no match. Now we had given saliva, fingerprints, palm prints, handprints, blood samples, hair samples, pubic hair samples, and handwriting samples. Weren't these enough to satisfy the police suspicions and convince them that we were innocent? Well, there's so many ideas in that set of paragraphs, but I did want to go through all of this one by one. Firstly, first part I would like to respond to would be this line here that some seasoned investigators outside of the Boulder Police Department believe JonBenet's murder had been a kidnapping gone wrong. Others believe that the killer was a demented pedophile. In searching for information, I learned that pedophiles typically take a child, molest them, and let them go. Now, this is something I have to disagree with because that is hardly a rule, or that is hardly something that you should expect when looking at true crime cases. There are just countless examples that come to mind. Number one would be the serial killer Albert Fish, whom I was talking about on the Friday segment. He abducted children, and sometimes he let them go, other times he murdered them. As I said, he was a serial killer. With Albert Fish, they're unable to determine exactly how many crimes he committed. He may have molested more than 100 children and let them go, but he definitely murdered them. So to say that that is indicative of the behavior of someone who was not a pedophile who was targeting children, absolutely not. Pedophiles do indeed try to abduct children, where they can murder the children. I mean, another example that comes to mind would be the story of Mr. Cruel, who was a serial rapist from Australia, and Mr. Cruel's most famous crime was the murder of Carmen Chan. Prior to the murder of Carmen Chan, that he was a serial rapist, and they believe that his violent tendencies escalated because he was a masked serial rapist, and they think that Carmen Chan had the ability to see Mr. Cruel without his mask on, thus revealing his identity, or perhaps she recognized something in his lair that would have again revealed who he was, so therefore she was murdered. So another reason why a pedophile would commit a crime is if he thought that he was going to get caught, or that his crimes would escalate to murder if it were being done to protect his identity. So I also don't think that this is a justifiable statement, and I'll even provide another example of this because one that's even more relevant to the JonBenet Ramsey case is found in Stephen Singular's book called Presumed Guilty, which talks about how in 1997 Jeremy Strohmeyer abducted a girl from a Vegas casino, took her into the bathroom, and murdered her. She was 7 years old. And that's an example of a pedophile that abducted the child and murdered them. Terrible, terrible stories. But to say that this is typical behavior of a pedophile, there are so many exceptions that go against that rule that I just don't think that that's going to hold up very well. But as we said, JonBenet Ramsey wasn't only murdered. There was a ransom note that was left behind. The next part is, to me, the ransom note read like the ramblings of a very unstable young person with a disgusting sick mind and imagination influenced by crime movies. I have to give credit to a lot of you in the comments section who pointed out that the ransom note contains the line, "Don't grow a brain, John." And you guys pointed out that that was mentioned in the 1994 movie Speed with Keanu Reeves. And it was also mentioned in the 1996 movie Ransom. JonBenet was murdered in December of 1996, and I actually looked it up. The film Ransom was released in November of 1996. So that actually seems like somewhat of a credible idea that this would be a younger person influenced by movies. Or my biggest challenge would actually be, why does it only have to be a young person? And I'm not going to lie to you guys, I had somewhat of a creepy feeling when I read that, because that's one of the reasons why I wanted to read the book The Other Side of Suffering. Because even though I don't think John Ramsey was the perpetrator in the murder of his daughter, I still wanted to leave no stone unturned and just see, some way, somehow, would there be an additional piece of information that could be leaked out. And when he's giving away, like sometimes people will do this, well, I think the killer would have done this. And This is also something that doesn't suggest too much of John's guilt, because number one, he says it was a young person, disgusting with a sick mind and imagination influenced by movies. Okay, I mean, that could be a child or an adult, though. And even though I haven't watched the movie Ransom yet, but it is on my list, it was a blockbuster at the time. See, we didn't have streaming services. We didn't have Netflix back in 1996. Everybody watched television, and they played previews for the movies all the time. I mean, you couldn't watch TV during the evening without seeing movie previews. And one of the movies that was heavily promoted in 1996 was Ransom. Even though I haven't watched the movie in its entirety, I do remember watching the previews all the time. But going on to the next part of the paragraphs. From the very beginning, police psychologists advised the detectives that the ransom note was not the kind of note a parent would write. All the credible experts assessed the likelihood of us being the author of this note to be nil. The Secret Service handwriting experts concluded that neither Patsy nor I had written the note. That didn't seem to deter the police away from the quick conclusions that we were guilty. A veteran district attorney told me there is nothing more dangerous in this country than police departments that have made up their mind. The police department had made up its mind on day one, and we're not about to be swayed by the facts. Okay, there are two things in there. Firstly, as for the handwriting, I am in the camp that I don't believe Patsy's handwriting is actually that similar to the ransom note when closely analyzed. And if you guys want to dispute that with me in the comment section, feel free to go ahead. You can also hit the like button and subscribe if you would want to follow along with these true crime discussions. But the point here, from the beginning, police psychologists advised that the ransom note was not the kind of note a parent would write. Here is the problem with this type of thinking. It's not meant to look like it was written by a parent. The whole point is that it was staged. It was meant to be deceptive. And when I was reading the book, The Death of Innocence, there is a section from the FBI profiler John Douglas that talks about how if parents are the murderers of their children, then they're going to place the body in a peaceful-looking way. And JonBenet Ramsey was found with duct tape over her mouth, her arms were tied together, she had been hit over the head, and she definitely wasn't placed in any peaceful sort of way. But the whole point is that it would have been staged to look like somebody else did it. So, again, as for the parts about the DNA, there is blood, saliva, fingerprints, palm prints, handprints, pubic hair samples, other hair samples, and not DNA but handwriting samples were also given by the Ramseys, and there's a very direct sentence here in the book, The Other Side of Suffering. There was no match. Do you accept that? Do you believe that? Because just to provide a little bit of counterbalance, just because there is no match, that does not mean that somebody is innocent. I mean, just because their finding isn't 100% positive or 100% conclusive or 100% definitively certain as a match, it does not necessarily mean that it's somebody else's DNA, because there can be interference. There can also be an inconclusive finding, and this is again something that we encounter when we explore true crime cases, that someone will provide a DNA sample and it comes back inconclusive, or they provide fingerprints and it comes back inconclusive. But what do you make of this? The Ramseys have provided all of this forensic material: saliva, fingerprints, palm prints, handprints, blood samples, hair samples, pubic hair samples, and handwriting samples, and they were not arrested. Or they were not charged with their daughter's murder. And if it were a family member, then DNA would have been involved, because Burke Ramsey is also a suspect in JonBenet's murder, Burke being her older brother. Now, what do you make of that? I mean, because again, they can see very easily if it's a family member because of genetics, and DNA is also familial. I mean, if I have to give an honest take on the subject, and I'm trying to play both sides of the issue because we want to give everyone a fair shot, or to explore ideas fairly, if you will, I think that some of the examples that have been provided in this part of the book are not very persuasive, like the thing about psychological profiling, or that pedophiles would not behave this way, or a parent wouldn't write a ransom note like this. That is not only insufficient, it's just completely wrong. It's just completely untrue. Of course criminals do things like that. People will go to great lengths to stay out of prison, and sometimes it's not even the prison sentences that they're afraid of. They simply do not want to be humiliated and put through the public trial. There are lots of reasons why people don't want to go to prison, but that's the driving force. They just do not want to get caught. And, I mean, I'm not seeing anything in these early paragraphs that has any strong inclination where I'm persuaded 100%. As far as the DNA evidence goes, I do find that that is somewhat compelling that they have provided all of these different samples, and they aren't able to definitively say that any of them came back as matching to the murderer of JonBenet. And when you watch the documentary Suburban Nightmare, which is available on Tubi for free, they take a very similar stance. And that documentary is done in somewhat of a persuasive essay fashion, where it tries to point out that, yes, this forensic material was collected, and the Ramseys were not matched to any of it. But which side do you agree with? Do you believe that the Ramseys are innocent and that the forensic testing is correct? Or do you believe that it was simply just an error in the testing methods? DNA was in its infancy when these samples were collected. I shouldn't have said that. DNA wasn't exactly in its infancy, but forensic technology has progressed so much since the 1990s, and so much since when the samples were gathered. So, which one do you agree with? Do you believe that it was a family member, or do you believe it was a completely outside entity? But here's the final point that I will leave you guys with, and that relates back to Stephen Singular's book, Presumed Guilty. Just because John or Patsy Ramsey, or even Burke Ramsey, was not the person who delivered the fatal blow to JonBenet, that does not mean that they didn't know who did it, or that they were covering for someone, or it could have been someone who had perhaps a high-ranking position at Lockheed Martin. And Lockheed Martin actually paid for John Ramsey's transportation after the murder of his daughter, the flights to Atlanta and such. That's other stuff that's mentioned here in the book, The Other Side of Suffering. And yes, of course, that would be an example of when my brain is connecting dots, and perhaps, yeah, I shouldn't. But I just wanted to share that, because that does come to mind, looking at Stephen Singular's book first and then The Other Side of Suffering. I also was surprised by the book The Other Side of Suffering by how much it focuses on the murder of JonBenet as opposed to the stories of dealing with grief and such, because it had been my understanding that this book was about the journey from grief to grace, which is included in the subtitle of it, and part of me began to think that John Ramsey maybe wanted a do-over for the book The Death of Innocence. When you read that book, there are all these types of stories about how they go to a vacation home and he's on a boat and he pretends that he's using a machine gun to mow down the paparazzi. And when I was reading that stuff, I was just like, whatever. That's hardly making a case for yourself or doing anything for your own benefit. And then with the book The Other Side of Suffering, I found that the points more clearly organized. But I would love to read your responses in the comments section down below. Do you believe that the DNA evidence exonerated the Ramseys, or do you think that they were simply inconclusive findings, or they did not match, or there's some type of cover-up going on? And please provide explanations why. Say anything that you would like. Feel free to look at some of the links in the description box. And as I said one more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And also feel free to visit some of the other episodes. Every Monday talking about the Zodiac Killer, Wednesdays about Jack the Ripper, and on the weekends talking about JonBenet. And look out for the YouTube shorts that are coming out. A couple of books about JonBenet have already been discussed. That will be all for me now. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there was always BlackBoxNet88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.